Hello, thank you for watching my channel. Today, I am going to tell you about why every bad in the Middle Ages, his Middle Ages. Close your eyes and listen to me. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I imagine walking into a medieval city on a summer afternoon, and a summer afternoon in the year 1350. Before you see anything, before your eyes adjust to the narrow streets and the timber-framed buildings pressing close, either side, the smell reaches you. It is not one smell, but many layered on top of one another, Unwashed bodies, animal dung, rotting food scraps, tanning leather, wood smoke, stagnant water, and beneath all of it, something sweet and terrible that you recognize without being able to name. This was the sensory reality of medieval Europe, a world that smelled nothing like anything available to modern experience and understanding. And ending why it requires understanding a society in which water was scarce, soap was a luxury, sanitation was non-existent, and the boundary between the human body and the filth of the world around, it was almost entirely absent. This is the history of why medieval people smelled the way they did, and what that smell meant for how they lived, how they thought out about disease, and how they understood the very nature of the human body. Chapter 1. Body they never washed. The popular image of the medieval person as someone who never bathed is most popular images brew. Both broadly true and significantly more complicated than it first appears. Medieval people did wash. The evidence for this exists in household accounts, in monastic rules specifying how monks clean themselves, in the existence of public bathhouses in most major medieval cities, and in the many artistic depictions of bathing that survive from the period. What medieval people did not do was wash with anything like the frequency, thoroughness, effectiveness that modern hygiene standards require. And the consequences of that gap, played out across an entire body over weeks and months, were profound. The full immersion bath that we take for basic of personal hygiene was, for most medieval people, an occasional event rather than a daily routine. Heating enough water to fill a tub required significant quantities of firewood, a commodity that poor households could not always spare, and the labor of hauling water from a well or river, and then heating it over a fire represented hours of work, simply to produce a single bath. In winter, the practicality of stripping entirely and sitting in water in an unheated room, limited further by the real risk of becoming paresis in the process. The result was that many people, particularly in rural areas without access public bathhouses, bathed fully perhaps a few times a year at most, and maintained whatever cleanliness they could achieve in between through partial washing of the hands, face, occasionally the feet. Skin that goes unwashed for weeks accumulates layers of dead cells, sweat, oil, and environmental grime that produce a distinctive, persistent odor. Without soap, which was available in medieval Europe but expensive and uniformly accessible. Even washing with water had limited ability to remove the oil-based compounds that bacteria feed on to produce body odor. Medieval people who worked physically demanding labor, which was the vast majority of the population, generated significant sweat daily, and that sweat, absorbed into clothing and redeposited on skin day after day without effective cleansing, create axing. He had a biological residue that no amount of fresh air could fully. There was also a layer of medical and philosophical effrating constraints. Medieval medical theory, derived from ancient Greek humoral medicine, Hedison held that pores of the skin were a gateway, which both beneficial and harmful forces could enter the body. Bathing in hot water was believed to open the pores and leave the body vulnerable to pestilential air. Therians particularly powerful traction during periods of epidemic disease. During the Black Death of the mid-4th century, physicians, actively advised against bathing on the grounds that opened pores would allow the corrupted air believed to cause plague to enter the body more easily. The result was the very medical establishment of the period, such as it was, sometimes counseled less washing rather than more, precisely the moments when hygiene was most critical. Chapter 2. The clothes that never came off. If the medieval body was rarely washed, the clothes that covered it were washed even less frequently. For much of the population, the line between what was worn during the day and what was slept in at night barely existed at all. Medieval clothing for ordinary people consisted primarily of wool, outer layers, and linen and undergarments worn directly against the skin. And while linen had the practical advantage of being washable, and was indeed washed more than wool, the wool garments worn on top of it went weeks or months between any form of cleaning. Wool was the primary fabric of medieval Europe, used for tunics, cloaks, hose, and the heavy outer garments that provided insulation against cold weather. It was extraordinarily difficult to wash effectively. Wool that is exposed to hot water and agitation shrinks and felts, losing its shape entirely. And so medieval wool garments were cleaned either by the bike-cold water washing, which removed surface dirt, but did little to address deep-set grease and biological residue, or by beating and airing, which moved odor temporarily, eliminating it. A wool garment worn daily through a working week, saturated with sweat and exposed to the smoke of a household fire, carried and chemical history in its fibers that accumulated with every wearing and diminished only slowly. Linen undergarments the layer worn against the skin, and changed more frequently than wool, were actually central to medieval concepts in a way it feels paradoxical today. Many medieval people understood changing their linen undergarment as the primary act of personal hygiene, a replacement for the full body washing they could not easily perform. Clean linen against the skin was considered the mark of a clean person, regardless of what the skin beneath it actually smelled like. And the ability to afford and maintain a supply of clean linen was a genuine marker of social status. A wealthy household with several sets of linen undergarments to rotate was understood clean. In a way, a poor household with a single set, until as it was visibly soiled, being washed, was not. The biological reality was more complicated. Even freshly washed linen placed against an unwashed body soared abswale in oil within hours and began developing the bacterial populations that produce odor within days. What the medieval understanding of cleanliness captured was a social and visual standard, linen that abwired, aid, and unstained, rather than a biological one. The smell that accumulated between the skin and the clean linen was this framework, and not present in visibleness. And what could not be seen was not in the medieval understanding of hygiene, a problem that needed addressing. Chapter 3. The streets beneath their feet, the individual human body, was only one source of the smell that defined medieval urban life. The streets of a medieval city were, by any modern standard, open sewers and accumulated waste of thousands of people, animals living in close quarters produced ambient odor, that saturated clothing, hair, skin, simply through the act of moving through public space. Understanding the medieval cities, smell requires understanding that there was no infrastructure in place to separate human beings from their own waste, and that the gap between where people lived and where waste was deposited was, in most cases, essentially non-existent. Human waste in medieval cities, typically in collect pits beneath or adjacent to houses. Period emptying by workers called gong firmers or night soil men, who removed the waste in the middle of the night and transported it outside the city walls. These cesspits frequently overflowed, cracked, or simply leaked into the surrounding soil, contaminate the wells that the same households drew drinking water from, producing a pervasive underground miasma that seeped upward through floors and walls. Streets were not paved in most medieval cities until surprisingly late in the period, and bare earth of an unpaved road absorbed decades of waste products, become saturated with biological material that released its smell particularly intensely in warm or wet weather. Animals were present in medieval cities in numbers that modern urban dwellers would find almost incomprehensible. Pigs, as were kept in cities as a form of waste disposal, their role as omnivorous scavengers, making them genuinely useful in consuming food scraps and refuse. Horses provided the primary means of transportation and were present on every major street throughout the day, depositing waste continuously. Cattle were driven through city streets to markets and slaughterhouse, and chickens, goats, and other livestock kept in courtyards and even ground floor rooms of urban houses. The waste produced by these animals mixed with human waste, rotting food scraps, and the runoff from various urban industries, particularly tanning, brewing, and butchering, all of which produced intensely pungent byproducts that were released directly into the nearest available waterway or street. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, and the Ruhrings running through virtually every major medieval European city were, by the later medieval period, essentially open sewers carrying the combined waste of tens of thousands of people, animals, and industrial operations. The smell rising from these rivers on hot summer days was documented repeatedly by contemporary writers as extraordinary, something that could be detected from considerable distance, and that made living in certain riverside neighborhoods a genuinely unpleasant experience, by the standards of people who know nothing else. The medieval city did not smell bad by accident or by neglect. It smelled bad because it had been built without any system for managing what let living organisms inevitably produce. And the accumulated result of that absence was an olfactory environment permeated every aspect of daily life. Chapter 4. The mouth no one cleaned. Of all the specific sources of a malevolent body odor, the mouth may have been the most immediately intimate, and the most consistently unpleasant to encounter in daily social interaction. Medieval dental health, poor by modern standards, not uniformly cared, but subject to a range of conditions that the period had a very limited ability to treat. And the consequences for breath were direct and significant. Medieval people did clean their teeth. There is documentary evidence from household manuals, medical texts, and monastic regulations specifying that teeth should be rubbed with cloths, with mixtures chalk and salt, or with twigs from certain trees whose bark had mild or abrasive or antibacterial properties. These methods were partially effective at removing surface deposits and stimulating the gums. They had no equivalent of the fluoride treatments and mechanical cleaning precision that modern dentistry provides, and they could not address the bacterial populations living below the gum line or in the tiny fissures of enamel where decay begins. Sugar, which is the primary driver of tooth decay, in modern populations was rare and expensive in medieval Europe, and therefore not consumed, in that instead the damaged teeth most severely. But this advantage was offset by other dietary factors. Coarse bread containing stone grit, consumed daily, were enameled down steadily. Particularly the sour ale and vinegary wine formed the basis of medieval daily fluid intake, eroded enamel over time, and the starches present in the grain-heavy medieval diet fed oral berda just as effectively as sugar, producing the acids that eat through an enamel on the volatile sulfur compounds that are primary chemical source of bad breath. Archaeological examination of medieval skeletal remains found high rates of dental caries, periodontal disease, and tooth loss in adult populations, with many individuals showing multiple unrepaired abscesses. An abscess is a bacterial infection, and bacterial infections in the mouth some of the most intense odors. The human body is capable of generating a medieval adult with multiple abscess teeth. An advanced periodontal disease would have produced breath that was immediately and powerfully noticeable to anyone within conversational distance, and with no effective treatment available for any of these conditions. The situation could only worsen. Over time, social interaction already conducted in those prox small rooms, nan rooms. This meant that this aspect of personal odor was shared constantly and unavoidably. Chapter 5. They lived and died in the medieval house, particularly for the majority of the population, who were rural peasants, was not the architecturally charming timber framed structure modern images of the period. It was a small, dark, smoky, and frequently damp structure that housed not only a family, but often their most valuable animals as well. And the smell generated within its walls was a concentrated version of all the odors of medieval life pressed into a space that might be no larger than a modern single-room apartment. The most distinct feature of the medieval peasant house as a source smell was the absence of a chimney in the earliest periods. Fires built on central hearths, and the smoke they produced rose through the interior of the house and escaped imperfectly through a hole in the roof or simply gaps in the thatch and timber. Everything in the house, the people, the clothing, food stores, this bedding on the floor, was continuously exposed to wood smoke, which settled on fabrics. Each setter and hair and skin could not be washed out without the kind of thorough cleaning rarely possible. People who lived in smoke-filled houses smelled of smoke as a baseline, and contemporary accounts suggest this was so universal as to be essentially unremarkable. Thatched roofs, which were the standard were the standard roofing material for the majority of medieval rural construction, were significant sources of odor in their own right. Thatch provided excellent insulation, but was also a habitat for insects, mice, rats, and birds, all of which nested in it, defecated in it, and occasionally died in it over years of use. A thatched roof accumulated decomposed slowly its byproducts into the interior of the house below. Rain drove moisture into the thatch, encouraging the growth of mold, and the acceleration of decomposition, and the smell of wet, aging thatch on a rainy day was distinctive enough to described in several contemporary sources. The practice of housing animals in the same structure as the human family, or in immediately adjacent space, sharing a wall, or even an interior access point, was common much of medieval Europe, particularly during winter, when the warmth generated by large animals was a practical supplement to the house fire. A cow, a pig, several goats. Woinus family contributed their own waste, their own body odor, and the smell of the feed and bedding straw that surrounded them to the already complex olfactory environment of the medieval home. This was not considered unusual or owed by the people living. It was the condition of medieval domestic life, and the smell it produced was the smell of a home. Chapter 6. They did about it. Medieval people, indifferent to smell, they were surrounded by it, assumed far higher baseline levels of environmental odor than any modern person experiences. But they were not without preferences, without a desire to smell better than their circumstances, truly, and without an array of methods for attempting to achieve that goal. The medieval fight against bad odor was real, creative, and both social aspiration and genuine medical belief. Herbs were the primary tool in this effort. Strewing herbs, plants with strong, pleasant fragrances, were spread across the floors of houses and public buildings to release their scent, when walked upon, and to mask us the smell of the organic material decomposing beneath them. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and sweet rushes were all used for this purpose, and their presence in a well-maintained household was a marker of domestic care and social standing. These same herbs were incorporated into sachets, stored clothing, both to discourage insects, transfer their scent to fabric that would otherwise smell only of the body that wore it, and the smoke that filled the house where it was kept. Perfume, in both liquid and solid forms, was known and used in medieval Europe, though access to it was sharply stratified by wealth. Rose produced from roses grown in monastic gardens, and was used by those who could obtain it to scent the skin, rinse the hair, and perfume clothing. Ambergris, civet, and musk. Animal-derived substances with powerful and persistent scent were incorporated into expensive compounds of valens available only to the wealthy. The demand for these products was real and consistent throughout the medieval period. Irregular appearance in trade records, household inventories of wealthy families, and the pharmacy accounts of monasteries. Fumigation was another widespread practice, burning aromatic substances, including juniper, fern, frankincense, and various resins, in a room or over clothing to replace existing odors with more pleasant ones. This served a dual purpose in the medieval understanding of the world. It addressed smell as a social and aesthetic concern, and it was believed to have genuine medical benefits, since strong aromatic smoke was thought to purify the air of the corrupting influences that caused disease. A person who burned juniper in their bedroom made the room smell nicer. They were, within the medical fratical framework of their time, actively protecting their health by improving the quality of the air they breathed. Chapter 7. The smell of the wealthy. The medieval world smelled differently depending on where you stood within it. And the gap between the olfactory experience of the wealthy and the poor was one of the clearest, most immediate markers of social distinction. Wealth did not simply purchase cleaner bodies and more frequent baths, though it did that too. It purchased access to a fundamentally different relationship with smell that expressed itself every aspect of daily life, from the clothes on a wealthy person's back to the floors of their castle hall. Noble and wealthy households had access to resources that made personal hygiene more achievable than it was for the poor. Large households employed servants specifically tasked with heating and preparing water for bathing, making the labor barrier to frequent washing and nets for those at the top of the social hierarchy. The bathhouses of the wealthy were often elaborate installations, wooden tubs large enough for full immersion, heated by fires dedicated to the purpose, and equipped with scented water prepared with rose petals, herbs, or expensive imported essences. Contemporary accounts of royal bathing and disappearance that, while still not equivalent to a modern shower, in terms of cleanliness, was dramatically more thorough and more frequent than what ordinary people managed. Clothing made the most visible olfactory difference. Fine wool, properly folded and finished by skilled craftsmen, was denser and smoother than the coarse cloth warmth worn by peasants, and its tighter weave meant that it absorbed and retained sweat and odor less readily. Linen of high quality, bleached white and finished to a smooth surface, could be washed more effectively and few more must blin closer because the household possessed water. The water fuel and labor to do so. Wealthy individuals also possessed multiple changes of each garment, meaning that while one set of clothing was being worn, others could be washed, aired, and treated with herbs, perfume, creating in rotation that individual garments relatively fresher than a neath anything achieved through the
single set wardrobe of a peasant. Spices and imported aromatics available to the wealthy also altered the smell of their food and therefore, through the processes of digestion and respiration, the smell of their bodies. A diet containing significant quantities of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other strongly aromatic spices produced different metabolic byproducts than a diet of plain grain and salted meat, and contemporary medical theory that held the aromatic properties of spices worked through the body as well as in the mouth, purifying the humors and sweetening the breath. Whether or not this was medically accurate, the wealthy person who ate a spiced diet and kept scented herbs in their clothing and burned aromatic substances in their rooms inhabited an olfactory world that was measurably different of the peasant a few miles away, and that difference was not incidental. It was cultivated deliberately as a mark of the distance between them. Chapter 8, Death, Disease, and the Air Itself. No discussion of navel smell can be complete without addressing the role that smell played in medieval medical theory. Because the relationship between odor and disease in the medieval mind was none or incidental. It was the central explanation for how illness spread and how it could be prevented. And this shaped every aspect of how medieval people understood, responded to, and tried to escape epidemics that them in enormous numbers. Miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by corrupted, foul-smelling air, was done in medical explanations. Illness throughout the medieval period and well beyond it, persisting in modified forms well into the 19th century. The theory had roots in ancient Greek medicine and was further developed by Islamic scholars, whose work was transmitted to medieval Europe through translation. Its logic was superficially compelling. Diseases tended to cluster in places that also smelled bad, near swamps, near rivers carrying waste, near accumulations of rotting organic material, near the bodies of the dead. The correlation between foul smell and illness was real, even though the causal relationship was inverted from the actual one. The smell was a byproduct of the same bacterial and chemical processes that cause disease, not the cause of disease itself, but without the germ theory of disease, which would not emerge until the 19th century. There was no framework available to make this distinction. The practical consequences of miasma theory were significant and contradictory. On one hand, it encouraged genuine public health measures. Medieval cities that accepted the miasma framework had reason to attempt to remove rotting organic material, drain stagnant
water, and clear carcasses from streets, all which did actually reduce disease transmission, even if not for the reasons their architects. On the other hand, the theory away from the actual mechanisms of disease transmission. Torqualden and air rather than contaminated water and person-to-person contact, and produced responses like the avoidance of bathing during plague epidemics that actively made disease transmission more likely. During the Black Death, the smell of the disease itself became one of the lived smacking aspect documented obsessively by contemporary writers. The bubonic plague produced large, necrotizing swellings in the lymph nodes that, when they burst, released a smell that writers of the period described as overpowering and unmistakable. The pneumonic form of the plague, transmitted through the air, was associated with breath that smelled of death itself, in a world that believed bad smell caused disease. Encountering a plague victim was therefore doubly terrifying. Not only were you witnessing suffering and death, you were also, in the terms of your own medical understanding, exposing yourself directly to very air that had made them ill. The smell of death in the medieval period was not merely a distressing sensory experience. It was believed to be a mortal threat in its own right. Chapter 9. Closing reflection. To imagine the smell of the medieval world, confront the most immediate and visceral of all the distances between that world and our own. We can see medieval art, read medieval literature, handle medieval objects preserved in museums, but the smell is gone entirely, dissolved into centuries of cleaner air. And perhaps this is why it is so difficult to fully absorb what daily life in that world actually felt like. The smell was not incidental to medieval experience. It was woven through every moment of it, present in the body, the clothing, the house, the street, the food, and the air itself, a constant sensory reality that not modern hygiene infrastructure has so thoroughly eliminated that we cannot even fully imagine its absence. What is perhaps most striking about the medieval relationship with smell is not how different it was from our own, how consistently medieval people tried to manage it within the means available to them. They used herbs and perfume. They maintained bathhouses in their cities. They changed their linen and aired their wool. They burned aromatic substances and scattered fragrance on their floors. They built medical theories around the premise that smell mattered to health, and they acted on those theories with the best tools their knowledge provided. They were not indifferent to their own odor. They were constrained by a world that had not yet developed the infrastructure to meaningfully address it. The history of why medieval people smelled the way they did is ultimately a history of what civilization has built, slowly and not always consciously, to put distances between human beings and the biological reality of their own bodies. Running water, sewage systems, soap made affordable through industrial pearl production, synthetic fabric that releases sweat rather than holding it, fragrance that prevents the decomposition of food, antibiotics that can treat the dental infections that once from the inside out. These are not luxuries. They are accumulated solutions to problems that medieval people lived inside every day without solution. The smell of the medieval world was the smell of a civilization doing its best without them.